So now that we know what TypeScript is, that we can add types to our programs with it, and how the syntax generally looks like, let's make sure we can all use TypeScript. And therefore, if you search for TypeScript, you can visit typescriptlang.org, and that's the official TypeScript webpage where you can learn more about TypeScript and where you can also learn how to install TypeScript. As a side note, if you want to learn way more about TypeScript, I also do have a complete TypeScript course where I dive deeply into TypeScript. In this module, I'll just cover some basics. So if you want to learn more, my full course might be interesting to you as well, or the official docs, of course, in addition. So now to install it locally, we can click here on install locally. And now we basically need to run this command here. Now for that, we need to make sure that Node.js is installed, but we needed this for this course anyways, and therefore that should already be installed. So therefore we can now run this command to install TypeScript. And running this command will install TypeScript into a specific project. If you want to install it globally on your system, then you need to run npm install -g TypeScript. But often installing it just into one specific project is enough so that you can then use TypeScript in that project into which you install it. And therefore, that's what I'll do here now. I will open my terminal, which is integrated here into this project, and run npm install TypeScript. And actually for this, I'll first of all run npm init -y to create a empty package.json file, because we'll need that to install dependencies, and then I'll run npm install TypeScript. And this will now install TypeScript into this project. So now TypeScript is installed. With that installed, we can now invoke the TypeScript compiler. And that is really important. As you learned, TypeScript is a superset to JavaScript, extending the JavaScript syntax with those extra types. Now, the important thing to note is that TypeScript code does not run in the browser though. So if you try to execute TypeScript in the browser, it will fail. Therefore, we need to compile TypeScript to JavaScript. And during that compilation process, all our type annotations will be removed because JavaScript doesn't know those annotations. But it's during this compilation step where we will be notified about errors, in addition to the notification we get in the IDE already. So it's this compilation step which then will warn us of potential code problems if we haven't spotted them in the IDE before. And then it's that compiled code which will run in the browser. Now, to invoke this compiler, we need to run this command here, npx tsc. So now if I run npx tsc like this, you'll see that I get an error though. I get this error because if I run this command just like this, then it expects a TypeScript configuration file in that project folder that tells TypeScript which files to compile. Now we'll add such a configuration file later. For the moment, we can run this command slightly modified. We can point at a file that should be compiled. In this case, with TypeScript.ts. So if I run npx tsc with TypeScript.ts, then this file is getting compiled. And hence now here I get one compilation error, the same error my IDE warned me about before. So if I haven't spotted it in the IDE, now I get an error here. Now you will notice that a no TypeScript.js file was created nonetheless. That simply happens because by default, even if you get an error during the compilation, it still completes. It just warns you because of that error, but it still gives you a JavaScript file. And this JavaScript file, this one here, is now based on our TypeScript file. And you see it's almost the same code, just without the types. And actually it changed const to var because by default right now it still also compiles the code such that it runs in older browsers as well. That is something which can be overwritten with the TypeScript config file, but we don't have such a config file yet, and therefore we have this code change as well. But of course you see that other than that, it's the same code as we wrote in the TypeScript file. Now, of course, we should get rid of that error though, otherwise using TypeScript doesn't make any sense, and hence I'll convert my two strings here to numbers, and if I save this now, the error is gone in the IDE, and if I now compile again, this also compiles without errors, and we still have the same JavaScript output as before. But now it's this JavaScript file which we could import here and use here. If I now save this and then reload this page, I get 7 again. But now, if we continue working in the TypeScript file and then compile it to run in the browser, now we actually protect ourselves against errors like we had it before, thanks to TypeScript. And now with that installed, and now that we understand what this compiler does and how this generally works, let's dive into some core features you need to know when working with TypeScript before we then thereafter are ready to use TypeScript with Angular. Now let's dig deeper into TypeScript. And for this, I'll add a new basics.ts file in which we'll dive into some core basics you need to know about TypeScript. And for that, I want to start with the basic types you can work with in TypeScript, which you will need all the time. And that will be our primitives, which we know from JavaScript, numbers, strings, and booleans. And then, of course, we also have more complex types like arrays or objects, for example. And then thereafter, we'll also talk about function types, parameters, and much more. So that's generally what I want to talk about here. And let's start with the primitives here. The primitive values we have in JavaScript are numbers, strings, booleans, and also null and undefined, and also symbols, but we can ignore that. And number, string, and boolean, as well as null and undefined, are the important ones therefore. Now, if we have a variable, let's say the age of a user, and we want to make it clear that in there we want to have a number, we can make that clarification with TypeScript by adding a colon after the variable name, and then simply specifying the type of value that should be stored in this variable. And then we can finish this variable declaration here. If I then later assign a value, assigning a number is okay, including floats, so numbers with a decimal place, but assigning a string would give me an error. That's what we saw before with that function and its parameters as well. Now, of course, we can also assign a value here right away. We don't have to have this declaration without a value assignment. Both is allowed. Now, we also can, of course, have a username, which should be a string, and for that, we can assign a type like this. String is the type we want to use here. And one important note here, in TypeScript, it's number and string written like this with lowercase starting characters. It's not number like this. We don't get an error if we use that, but this actually points at the number object in JavaScript. We want the number primitive type, which starts with a lowercase n. The same for string. We want the primitive type, which starts with a lowercase s. And then, of course, here we can assign a value. And we can also, of course, store Boolean values like is instructor and add Boolean as a type assignment so that thereafter I may store true or false in that variable. And these are our core primitive value types which we can assign, in this case to variables. Before we also saw how we set types for function parameters. And we'll see more places where we can set types in the next minutes. Now, as I mentioned, we also have null and undefined as types, but we don't typically set something to be null. If I set hobbies to null here, then this would be possible. but then whenever I try to assign anything, I get an error, which of course is not too useful. Instead, we'll use null and undefined in a slightly different way, which we'll learn about in a couple of minutes. So numbers, strings, and booleans are the core primitive value types we should be aware of.